this first paper presentation session on smell, cities and war. The first presentation will be given by Tullett. Fyodor is a first-year PhD researcher at the University of York, specialising in Russian sensory history and the history of war. His previous research interests include the history of commemoration, and his MA dissertation in public history focused on the role of Victory Day parades in Russian war commemoration tradition. His BA research focused on autobiographical publications in late imperial Russia. His current research into the sensory history of the siege of Leningrad won the first place prize of the University of York's annual institutional PhD spotlight competition. Fyodor curated the 2024 iteration of the See Yourself on the Shelf project, assisting the University of York's library in diversifying the collections. He also worked with Hull Minster on an oral history research project, interviewing congregational members about their use of the Minster as a space of a place of prayer. In 2022, he worked on an inquest into the LGBTQIA+ histories of the University of York between 1964 and 2004 in a bid to update research guidelines on LGBTQIA+ histories. Before his relocation to the UK, he worked closely with the International Memorial, a Russian NGO banned by the Russian government in 2022, assisting with the delivery of temporary exhibitions dedicated to Gulag victims' letters across schools in Moscow. Let's please welcome Fyodor.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. I will be saying some slides.
You should do it.
Oh, is there? Perfect.
No.
There's absolutely no pressure on me for being the first panelist, by the way. So my research is concerning the diaries of the siege of Leningrad, and my current paper is dedicated to the imagined scents that are in the diaries. I will be focusing on 4 case studies, 2 of which will be about hallucinations and 2 of which will be about memories of smell. Now, as a brief introduction, there's a great paper on smell walks by Jean Clark. She argues that our olfactory imagination may trigger experiences that are very similar to the act of smelling through interaction with non-olfactory source material. So instead of just smelling the actual object, you think of something and you feel like you feel the smell, but it is not actually there. And in her paper, Jean Clark speaks of an interview with a former Bosnian prisoner of war who invoked very powerful memories of sharing family recipes among the starving prisoners in the camp, and thoughts of the very feeling hearty and aromatic food, calming and comforting men. Now, Clark's paper could be criticized for making assumptions about the smell of food because she may not be as familiar with the Balkan food culture, being from there, but also the fact that her interviewees never really mentioned the smell directly, which is used that they do. But it was this work that kind of inspired my research into the imaginary sense aspect of the siege of Leningrad. So a brief introduction into the siege of Leningrad. The siege, part of World War II, lasting from late summer of 1941 to January 1944, was an absolute disaster for the civilian population of the city, with all of the supply routes cut off, except for a very perilous winter ice road and a narrow summer navigation route through Lake Ladoga. The city starved. The result of the immediate post-war investigation into the mortality of these civilians showed that over 600,000 people were killed, of which only 20,000, 3%, died as a result of direct artillery or aerial bombardment impact. The rest succumbed to hunger or illness. The grim reality of the horrors of the daily life under siege and its stark contrast to the jubilant narratives of the great victory of the Soviet people meant that much of the initial historiography concerning the siege simply ignored the testimonies and experience of the siege survivors and people who experienced it, instead of focusing on the technical aspects of the great feat of a lifting siege. It was not until the 1980s with popular narratives finally reached the press and saw light, with the key work of the time being analysed and the Iranian's siege book, which is a chronicle of the siege events made through oral history interviews of the siege survivors and witnesses. Now, an even more elusive, and this is where my research comes in, source on the history of the siege are the siege diaries. Use these 2 scans of the diaries to illustrate what they look like. This is what I work with, although I have to say that the majority of the source material has been transcribed, even though it hasn't been published, but it's very neat to showcase what they actually look like. These diaries written primarily civilian members of the population, although it is important to note that in the siege circumstances, the line between who's in the military and who's not was largely blurred, as the nurses turned into frontline medics, writers and journalists turned into war correspondents, and teenagers who just went to school became fire wardens and air raid wardens. These documents provide an invaluable insight into the daily lives of Leningrad under siege. Due to the explicit details of harsh life and survival under inhumane conditions, often engaging with aspects of the siege life that were quite unsavory for the official historiography of the war, like stealing, interacting with the black market, rumors of cannibalism, and the occasional criticism of the city's government and military executives' decision. These diaries have not been widely published until the late 1990s, and with the exception of Alexis Perry's absolutely brilliant work called The War Within, which was published in 2017, they remain not really well known in the West. My research focuses on the sensory aspect of the siege diaries because there is remarkably a lot of sense there. Smells, sounds, you name it. And this paper specifically is dedicated to the olfactory imagination and hallucination in the siege diaries. Like I said, I'll be focusing on hallucination and memories. I'll be focusing on 2 case studies out of the wider corpus of siege diaries that I'm currently in the process of collecting, which totals 205 diaries, and the 2 diaries that this paper will be concerned with are written by 2 young women, Narida Tsenikova and Galina Zivitskaya. Both were quite young at the start of the siege. One was 13 and the other 21. One was a schoolgirl who later worked as a fire warden at a food factory, and towards the end of the siege became an artist, went to art school, and then worked at the Film, which is the main film production studio in Leningrad at the time. And the other was a student nurse who later became a surgeon. Both of them survived the siege, and the diaries are absolutely priceless as the testimonies. Now, let's start with the diary of Narida Sednikova. In her diary entry dated December 24th, 1941, Narida Sednikova recorded her olfactory hallucination. Here's what she wrote. Busy today, revising pathologic anatomy. It's getting hard to concentrate. I have to stop myself and reread the same sentences. I'm saddened to say that it came to hallucination. I read a page on liver pathologies, and I hear how it, the liver, sizzles on the pan. I even felt dizzy from the smell. Interestingly enough, she doesn't write anything else about this specific hallucination. The only sentiment towards the record is the rather stoic, I'm saddened to say. Now, her stoic reaction to what must have been a rather terrifying experience can be initially interpreted as a hint towards a desensitization to the general horrors and the horrible smell of the siege. After all, the siege has been going on for months. But in actuality, the sheer fact that a very vivid, and well, she records that the smell made her dizzy, hallucination, was triggered by a black and white medical diagram that is quite unappetizing. It is highly likely that it was this book from which the diagram came from, by the way. This is the most up-to-date pathologic anatomy textbook published in the Soviet Union at the time. Unfortunately, it's not openly available online, but I have a picture of the cover of it. Trust me, anatomical diagrams are not appetizing. The brief, I'm saddened to say, comment that, like I said, sounds quite stoic and desensitized, has much more depth upon further inspection. It can have a dual meaning. The first, perhaps a more speculative interpretation, can see this comment as a worry about the potential of eating human liver. The cannibalism under siege is very much a taboo topic, and many diaries mention with great fear. The rumors of the corpses found with missing flesh and body parts are quite frequent in diaries. It's thus not surprising that Sednikova would be at the very least saddened, if not in fact mortified, by the fact that she just thought of human liver in a food setting. The second interpretation has to do with her occupation as a nurse, as she recorded food-related hallucinations in her patients dying of hunger. She's likely worried that she's close to death as well. Now, a mere month after that hallucination during a shift at the hospital, she reported an olfactory hallucination experienced by one of her patients. Here's what she wrote. I noticed the patient trying to get up. He kept looking at me. I came up and asked was you who told me about the potatoes," he whispered to me. I tried to explain that he's mistaken, that he imagined the potatoes. "But the potatoes are ready. I saw them. I smelled them," he insisted. I knew this was a hallucination, and the last hallucination of that, but what could I do? Give him a spoonful of the bromides solution, but it has frozen in the supply code. She dryly regrets that the medicine she could have given the man to ease his hallucination is frozen, so she cannot even help. And she's very much understanding that this man is dying very soon. And yet again, the dry tone with which she records this can be interpreted as desensitization. In fact, she does record quite a few deaths as a nurse, unfortunately, that's part of her profession. But the fact that she does that can also hint at the fact that these are actually signs of great emotions and worries that she has bottled up within her, because she has to witness all of that. And a mere month before, she in fact had an olfactory hallucination herself. Now, these two cases of olfactory hallucinations are very interesting given the prompts that have triggered the experience. For her own hallucination, the prompt was a medical diagram. She's, like I said, not appetizing, doesn't smell of anything, but probably the book and the paper. And for the dying man's hallucination, my guess is as good as hers, but I think her version of this is his last dying thing is quite plausible. Now, these recorded hallucinations are particularly interesting because the main narrative of the sensory history of war is very commonly preoccupied with the smells of actual battle, like the smell of gunpowder, the smell of the rotting bodies, the destroyed sanitation, the sewers being blown apart, stuff like that. But in fact, this is a very valuable addition to the overall sensory history of war, because this is preoccupied with other wartime smells that may not be directly linked to war, but are by context. Moving on to Berlin-Sinitskaya, in contrast to the previous diarist, none of the imagined olfactory experiences in Sinitskaya diaries are hallucinatory, rather they stem from previous memories. Considering her young age, and she was only 13 when the war started, it likely played a factor in comparing the happy childhood years in the late 1930s Leningrad to the grim realities of sieging the siege. The first imagined olfactory experience in Kudari comes on New Year's Eve, 31st of December 1941. Here's what she wrote. It's New Year's in a few hours, but nothing reminds us of that. I laid in bed and remembered what I knew the rituals were like before the war. My mum and I bring up a tall, fluffy fir tree, and the entire flat filled with the smell of fir and sap. The dinner table is by the wall, and there's a mountain of baubles on it, little boxes and candy. We put pretty colourful chocolate candies on the tree under the baubles. Recollecting the happy memories from the pre-war festive period and thinking about the smell of fine resin and fir that accompanies the holiday tree, Kalina suddenly realized that some of the colourful sweets that would be hung in the tree as decoration for several years may still be somewhere. She in fact does go and find the box of the old pre-war sweets that, by the way she describes them, were likely apple marshmallows. And even though this is clearly not enough to save the family, unfortunately her stepfather on the right side of the picture there, left side of the picture, dies during the siege, but she and her mum survive. That finding the candies definitely helped her bring some festive period to family. Now, a very interesting experience indeed, but upon further reading, some details can be spotted. Firstly, you may have already noticed that the memory that she records is written down in present tense. And it's not just me being clumsy with my translations and struggling with English. It is exactly how it is recorded even in Russian. She records her memory in present tense in her diary. Sounds like a minor detail, but it's very important. Reading into the language used suggests how vivid this memory is, and the use of the present tense means that she experiences it rather than just remembers it, which makes it, I would argue, closer to hallucination than just a memory, because she's laid in bed and she remembers it. The laid in bed part is also very important because she's not just laid in bed because it's close to her bedtime. This is the first siege winter. This is what Leningradists did to conserve energy. They just spent their entire days in bed because moving meant spending calories and death, because the rations of the first siege winter were about 200 grams of bread a day on average, which is about 2 slices of toast, and this is you would get. The date is also very significant. This is New Year's Eve. This is what Soviet Russians saw as their Christmas holiday. That was what Christmas was replaced with in the secular Soviet Union. So this also challenges the very common view of the siege of Leningrad as a liminal space, where people sort of don't experience the flow of time anymore and they just sort of exist there when until the siege is lifted. No, in fact, they have really, really good understanding of what time it is. It's New Year's, it should be festive, but it's not. Now, the second case from the diary, when she invoked the olfactory memories of the pre-war times, is recorded in the entry for June 14th, 1942. Describing the new neighbours that moved into the block in place of the old neighbours who died during the first siege winter, she notes the smell that accompanies them. Mr. and Mrs. Antonevich are our new neighbours for about a week now. In the evening, as they come from work, candy smell, apologies for my typo, fills the flat. It smells unbelievably sweet and tasty and makes me think of pre-war sweets, even though I was always indifferent to sweet things, and now I simply cannot imagine how they work in the production halls surrounded by all of this yummy produce. First thing one might notice about the century is how the smell that comes off the neighbours is almost more important than the neighbours themselves. In fact, Helene is not speaking very much of them in the century overall. She's more preoccupied with the fact that they work at a candy factory, ignoring the fact that they moved in to a place the neighbours who died of hunger earlier in the year, and the neighbours she liked very much. Now, this is not her being quite selfish. It is indeed the painful and traumatic relationship with food that is quite common among the siege survivors to this day speaking. Another crucial detail from this entry is her discovery that people can smell like food. Obviously, people can smell a certain way, be it a pleasant smell, maybe like perfume, or unpleasant smell, like a not nice perfume, or very heavy body odor. But this change of attitudes towards describing what people smell like is very important here. Another point of notice is that she recalls that she didn't really like sweet things before the war, even though she remembers what they smell like, but now she could eat them all, basically. Now, this is a very common case in a few diaries. I've actually found how people who used to hate a certain type of food, now that there's a general food shortage, they will eat anything. The other notable case concerns fish oil, notoriously sticky substance. Now, these changes suggest that there is a much bigger nuance in what they feel like a dismissive initial idea of how the olfactory experiences in the siege unfolded, with a shift towards desensitization. Not desensitization, in fact, people are smelling perhaps even more than before the war. Now, to conclude, I've only looked at 2 out of the hundreds of the siege diaries, and I've looked at only 4 cases of imagined olfactions, 2 hallucinations, and 2 sort of more memory-like. The cases presented today, as well as the sensory input into diaries, open exciting new perspectives of sensory history of the war and the siege of Leningrad specifically. Today, the sensory research of warfare is predominantly occupied with specific war smells, broken sanitation, rotting corpses, and other war sounds like buzzing bullets and winged artillery shells and like. But the Leningrad siege diaries, while confirming the reality of the established war senses, yes, Leningradists do record their smell of corpses left rot, and they do record these sounds of the bombs exploding, open another dimension in the study of the war and the senses, ordinary or peaceful smells during wartime. Reading a book about pathologic anatomy, Nicola does not think of what she may smell in the operating theatre assisting at surgery of another bomb victim, or the smell of decomposition in the morgue, but rather she hallucinates about the smell of roast liver, which may sound disgusting, but it's actually a peacetime comfort food. I know that liver may not be liked, but for us it is sort of nice. And the festive mood that Kalinitskaya is put in her diary memories also suggest that it's not just all about warfare. People still remember the holidays and people still think to be peaceful times. Now, while yes, the diaries detail much of the daily struggles and the horrors of the siege, they also reveal that, for the lack of better words, life went on. With her input into the diaries ongoing, I'm expecting to find even more evidence of its sensory landscape of the HTT, uncovering sensory history when hunger was used as a weapon of war and
and the reclamation of her intellectual legacy in early 20th century Egypt. Zana holds both a BA and an MA in English literature, with a minor in Arabic from the American University of Beirut, graduating with high distinction. Her research interests include the Arab Renaissance, Nada, women's studies, comparative literature, and global modernism. Her publications include co-authoring 101 Arab Women Writers, 2024, and contributing a chapter on Ziadeh's, Kalima Isharat, also 2024, with the Women and Memory Forum in Cairo.
Thank you. Welcome. I'd like to start my presentation today with the following quote by Palestinian thinker and writer Mahmoud Darwish, in which he says, "So cities are smells. Accra is the smell of iodine and spices. Haifa is the smell of pine and wrinkled sheets. Cairo is the smell of mango and ginger. Beirut is the smell of the sun, sea, smoke, and lemons. Damascus is the smell of jasmine and dried fruits. Tunis is the smell of night musk and salt. Rabat is the smell of henna, incense, and honey. A city that cannot be known by its smell is unreliable. Exiles have a shared smell, the smell of longing for something else, a smell that resembles another smell, a panting, nostalgic smell that guides you, like a worn tourist map, to the smell of the original place. A smell is a memory and a setting sun." I carry Darwish's quote with me wherever I go. It lingers, especially when I walk in places that are familiar in form but distant in effect. In Cambridge, for example, I often find myself disoriented, not as much by what I see and not see, but by what I don't smell. And then, intentionally or not, I do. The faintest trace of za'atar in my breakfast, a hint of jasmine clinging to someone's scarf, stop me in my tracks. One particular scent, however, arrests me most: the smell of burning bread. It brings me immediately back to the memory of my grandmother's home. Transported to cozy evenings during winter in Lebanon, cousins curled around wool blankets, hands curled around teacups. The smell of something always slightly scorched, but made with love. These memories never arrive through deliberate thought. They come through the memory of the body. This is not just nostalgia. It's a moment of what Marcel Proust called involuntary memory, where a sensory trigger brings back entire constellations of the past, bypassing both logic and language. And this brings me to the heart of this presentation. How do we think of scent, not only as a memory trigger, but as a literary and political act? How do writers mobilize sensory experience to reclaim histories, geographies, and affective relationships to spaces that have been disrupted, if not erased? The writer I turn to today, Babaie, understood this deeply. Though rarely categorized under sensory literature, her 1916 prose text, Dhikra wa Damma, or read in translation A Memory and a Tear, is an early and powerful archive of sensory imagination. In this piece, Ziadeh, who is unable to travel due to the constraints of World War I, undertakes an imagined journey across Greater Syria, traversing Palestine, Lebanon, and Syria by sea and land in a fictive memory state. But this is not a narrative of place in the abstract. The places she visits are reconstructed through their smells, sounds, textures, and cultural rhythms. Before borders and wars broke the region into discrete entities, before trains stopped running from Beirut to Jerusalem south or Damascus up north, before Jaffa's orchards were turned into militarized zones, Ziadeh imagined and preserved the Levant not through the language of maps, but through the language of the senses. And central to this language is scent. As anthropologist Clausen has shown, scent is not simply an atmospheric or decorative detail in culture. It's a central organizing principle in how we relate to identity, community, memory, and even morality. As Clausen further argues, I quote, "Not all societies devote equal attention to the senses," unquote. However, in Arab tradition, scents have deep social and symbolic weight. Attar for purification, incense for hospitality, kuhl for care, to mention but a few examples. To write scent in this context is then to write intimacy. At the same time, scent is ephemeral. It cannot be archived like a monument or a document. It disappears as quickly as it arrives, making its presence all the more powerful when captured in literature. Ziadeh's A Memory and a Tear performs this archival act. It captures what is otherwise ungraspable. My aim in this talk is to trace how Ziadeh's piece becomes not just a work of memory, but a poetics of olfactory belonging. Her writing defies fragmentation and insists on unity, not through empire, but through fragments. And it is in this orientation and this sensual grounding that I argue becomes a form of resistance. Ziadi was born in Nazareth, occupied Palestine, in 1886. She later moved to Lebanon to complete her education in French, and in 1908, she and her family settled in Cairo. There, she became one of the most significant intellectual voices of the Arab Renaissance, or the Nahda. Ziadi was a prolific writer, editor, translator, and literary salon hostess. Her literary presence was felt in the columns of major newspapers and in her famous Tuesday Literary Salon, which lasted for almost 20 years, bringing together thinkers, poets, musicians, and politicians to debate the present and future of Arab culture. Being fluent in Arabic, French, English, German, Italian, and Spanish enabled Ziadi to engage critically with both the Arab and European literary cultures. Her translations of European novels into Arabic and her biographical essays on early Arab women writers show how she challenged dominant gender discourse and created a space for women to emerge on podium and in print. She's also famous for being the first Arab woman writer to write about other women, hence initiating a tradition and a discourse of what we call today women's writing on women's writing. While Ziadi lived most of her life in Egypt, her writing constantly returned to the Levant. In her time, the distinctions we make today between Palestine, Lebanon, and Syria were far more fluid, and they were actually all part of a bigger entity called Greater Syria, or in Arabic, Bilad al-Sham. These lands were intertwined by language, memory, and lived experience. To travel by train from Beirut to Damascus or by boat from Jaffa to Alexandria was commonplace. Ziadi's writings rose from this historical intimacy, especially in the text I'm discussing today, the Krawadama, when such movement was beginning to become and feel impossible. As Lashman reminds us, literature is a mnemonic medium that not only creates new texts to be remembered, but also recovers suppressed knowledge, revives obsolete knowledge, and reincorporates formerly rejected unofficial or arcane traditions of knowledge. End quote. Amamiri and Natir exemplifies this function by restoring marginalized forms of knowledge and memory otherwise obscured or silenced by colonial modernity and exclusionary histories. Ziadi was acutely aware of her exilic condition in Cairo. She writes in one piece about escaping the burning sand of Egypt and finding solace in the cool river of Nahr Safa in Lebanon. Waters that, she says, allowed her to wash out the dirt of modernity from her eyes. While this quote alludes in an obvious manner to romanticism, it also creates an experience of sensory cleansing, or in other words, a metaphorical act of remembering the homeland through the body. Amamiri and Natir emerges from this condition of separation from the homeland. Given the upheavals of World War I, which left the Levant in a state of famine and destruction, from 1915 to 1918, Ziadi could not go for her yearly ritual to the Levant during the summers. Instead, she undertakes a fictive literary journey. As Edward Said reminds us in Reflections on Exile, exile produces not only pain, but also a heightened sense of perception. The exile becomes, I quote, an expert on the lived texture of dislocation, end quote. Ziadi's prose embodies this. It's textured with smells, sounds, and images so vivid they seem to bypass the reader's mind and move directly into the senses. The dislocation intensified after the First World War, when the collapse of the Ottoman Empire and the Sykes-Picot Agreement redrew the Levant's geography into fragment states under French and British control, leading up to 3 separate countries. In the next slide, I'm sharing with you a map of Palestine and Lebanon from the archive in year 1915 to help us imagine Ziadi's journey, given that sense are unfortunately inaccessible. As if departing from Egypt by boat, Ziadi greets her homeland, saying, "Peace upon you, small beautiful Syria." The journey begins with the sight of Jaffa, a queen seated Jaffa? A queen seated on her throne by the shore, surrounded by gardens and groves. The air, she notes, is rich with the mingling scents of oranges and lemons, mixed with the strong bitterness of the sea breeze. From Jaffa, roads extend inland toward Al Khalil, Gaza, and Jerusalem, where the city's hills and plains carry the weight of centuries. Samaria's streams evoke a continuous song, filled with the grandeur of praise and reverence. As Ziadi travels north, Haifa emerges as a bustling port city embraced by Mount Carmel, the latter descending from the Olive Mountains. And I hope we're all aware of the significance olive trees carry for Palestinian and their collective memory in relation to the land. Haifa leads to Tyre, which carries a mythical allure tied to Agenor and his 3 sons. Cadmus, who brought the alphabet to Greece, Phoenix, who lent his name to the region of Phoenicia, and Europa, who gave her names to the continent of Europe. Ziede describes Tyre's economic legacy as, I quote, the great station for trade and communication, with ships connecting the city to Britain, the Canary Islands, the Red Sea, and India. Moving on to Sidon and then to Beirut, Ziede writes with nostalgia. Who among us does not have a memory in Beirut if he is Syrian? As a hub of rail connections, Beirut is depicted as a gateway to a number of destinations. The cedar cities of Mount Lebanon, Baalbek and its magnificent ruins, and Damascus with the rivers. As Ziede envisions Aleppo next, she recalls the legacy of the Arab poet Abu al-Ala al-Ma'arri, whose philosophical reflections on doubt and sorrow remained influential in Arab literary heritage. These scenes are lastly culminated in a pastoral sense of shepherds in its countrysides, in which the quote reads in translation, this is a miniature portrait of Syria, with its grand cities, lesser-known towns, villages, plains, mountains, valleys, rivers, lakes, forests, and rocks. I saw it in my imaginary journey, and I saw shepherds walking behind their flocks across the meadows, playing their long, mournful melodies on their flutes. I saw the mountain dwellers gathered under the big trees bearing fruits, singing underneath them Ataba. And Ataba is a traditional Arabic musical form usually sung at weddings and festivals and other occasions. By grounding her account in such sensory details, Ziede transforms the fictive nature of her voyage into a testament of history, offering an alternative archive of olfactory, visual, and auditory experiences. Her narrative breathes life into landscapes, each defined by its unique history, myths, and heritage, while still united under one nation. Ziede, in other words, asserts the continuity of Arab cultural life, a life rooted in ritual, scent, sound, and place-based knowledge. The urban communities in trade and the pastoral communities singing Ataba, the scents of citrus and jasmine, and the sounds of streams and fruits all assert the diverse cultural history of a land whose communities are now dispersed and whose landscapes, especially in Palestine, have been occupied. Palestinians have not only been stripped of their lands, but also of the history of this land. As Falah notes in his article Geographies of Silence, Palestine's landscape has been, I quote, manipulated in order to be absorbed into the national myth and lexicon of claims to the land, enabling the metaphor of a geography of emptiness rather than a genuinely historical geography of Palestine. With history often instrumentalized as a medium serving political aims, Arab-Palestinian heritage has frequently been ignored, obfuscated, or silenced. End quote. Against the colonial manipulation of land and history, Ziede's Bikra wa Damha emerges as a crucial intervention in the writing of Palestine's historical geography. Born and raised in Nazareth, Ziede is a native of Palestinian land, and her historiography reclaims a pre-Nakba narrative by filling gaps left by exclusionary histories. Moreover, Ziede's insistence on reclaiming the homeland through literature anticipates more contemporary projects of feminist recovery. Her evocation of smells, textures, and oral traditions constitute what Hardman coined as a critical fabulation, a means of re-narrating obscured or silenced histories through imaginative and affective means. Ziede does not reconstruct a lost homeland through documents or declarations, but through her body's memories of moving across that space. Writing on the anthropology of smell, scholar Legoubert notes that olfactory memory is more enduring than visual memory, as it's tied directly to the limbic system in the brain. Smells bypass rational thought. They are embodied, uncontrollable, and deeply emotional. Ziede anticipates this understanding. She offers no maps and only sensations. The homeland is not reconstructed by political cartography, but by olfactory and affective memory. We might also consider Sarah Ahmed's notion of orientation. Ahmed writes that to be oriented is to know where one is in this world, and to be disoriented is to feel lost, even in familiar places. Ziede writes through the sense of disorientation. Her fictive journey is a way to reorient herself, and in doing so, she also reorients us back to the smell of the Levant, not as a war-torn terrain, but also as a richly lived and remembered place. Reading a memory and the tear today, I am reminded once again of another quote of Mahmoud Darwish, in which he says, writing is the other shape of the homeland. Ziede writes not just to remember the homeland, but also to reclaim it. Her imagined journey from Cairo to Greater Syria is political in its refusal to forget what was once home. In this literary journey, the Levant is not fragmented into states and checkpoints as it is today. It's a continuum of citrus groves, music, coastal breezes, and dialects. From Haifa to Baalbek, Jerusalem to Damascus, the sense Ziyadi evokes form a map of belonging that refuses colonial logics of erasure. Today, for valid reasons, the Levant is remembered globally through tragedy. Explosions, occupations, refugee crises, and environmental collapse. The soundscape is dominated by drones, soundscape by smoke and ash, if not by burning bodies, amidst the ongoing genocide in Gaza. Under such conditions, can we still imagine the smell of citrus trees in Jaffa, or the damp soil of Beirut after the first rain? Ziyad's work insists that we must. The ability to recall these smells is not an escapist romantic mode. It is rather resistance, or at least one form of this resistance. In a time when sensory landscapes are being systematically destroyed, literature can preserve what the senses know, but politics has forced forgetting. Here, I return to the premise of this symposium, that olfactory heritage is essential to how we imagine, remember, and relate to place. Ziyad's literary landscape is one such olfactory archive. Her imagined homeland is tactile, aromatic, and most importantly, inhabited. Metaphorically speaking, it carries the sense of continuity in the face of rupture. Read in its context, A Memory and a Tear is not an isolated piece of writing. It's a culmination of Ziyad's life in exile, her intellectual resistance to later colonial fragmentation, and her belief in the power of literature to restore what displacement tries to sever. It is quite literally a tearful memory, to borrow from her title, but also a deliberate and resilient call to fully remember. This makes her work particularly resonant in our memory today, when displacement is both physical and sensory. As we read this text now, Ziyadi teaches us that remembering is not always intellectual. It is also felt, smelled, and heard. The alternative archive of senses in her fictive journey is not merely a nostalgic tribute to the past, but a tribute to the politics of hope necessary to keep us moving through the world amidst the horrors. It bears witness to a time when communities sang, harvested, traded, and traveled seamlessly between Syria, Palestine, and Lebanon. Ziyad's narrative in this voyage reminds us of what remains, both in literature and the collective Arab memory, despite the consistent attempts at erasure. Thank you.
Hello everyone, welcome back. I'm Sussan, and I'm a PhD student from University of York. And it's my pleasure to chair the second panel about olfactory perception and imaginary. And the first presenter will be Janice Wang, and her title is The Role of Imagination in Olfactory Perception, How One Expertise Shapes Olfactory Imaginary and Language. And Dr. Wang is Associate Professor of Consumer Behavior at the University of Copenhagen, with a background in experimental psychology and computer science. Her research explores multisensory flavor perception and how imagination shapes olfactory experience. Welcome.
Oh, thank you.
So let's get started. Good morning, everyone. My name is Janice. You're right, it is weird with holding the microphone. I'm like a stand-up comedian. So I come from the sciences where we're not used to reading a paper. So I'm just gonna talk even more like a stand-up comedian. So for the work that I'm presenting to you here, I would first like to thank my lovely collaborators on this work, Ilya Kroman and Bob Pellegrino from Cornell University. So this is a work about wine expertise. And before I start, I should also say that while I am an associate professor at the University of Copenhagen, I am also what you might call wine expert. On paper, I am Denmark's top wine expert. But anyways, so I have interest in both fields. So as introduction, some things about mental imagery. Mental imagery is the ability to experience or re-experience a particular object or event. This morning we have already heard talks about this. And we know that wine experts and novices differ in their ability to describe and imagine wines.
No?
Ask you to click. There we go. And in this study, we were interested in the relationship between the ability to imagine and the ability to describe wines. And for this talk, I have, oh, yes, and how does expertise influence, wow, this is clicking all over the place. Okay, how does expertise influence and refine our sensory representations? So, okay, so group exercise for everyone here. Please imagine that you're at a vineyard. In fact, beyond just imagine, I have really a group exercise. If you have a phone, can I ask you to please scan the QR code and answer some questions? These are the same questions that we used for our survey, so I wanted to give you a more in-depth idea of what we did. So if you scan the QR code, you should come to a Menti site, and you can just click next, and then answer some sets of questions about your experience. Is anyone having trouble accessing?
Yeah, Wi-Fi.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, the connection is not very good.
But so while some people are doing it, I can also go through the questions that people are answering. So in the first set of questions, the prompt is, imagine you're visiting a sunny vineyard and you order a glass of your favorite sparkling wine on the outdoor terrace. Nice imagination. So on a scale from 1 to 5, how vivid is the color of the wine? How vivid is the smell of the wine? How vivid is the taste of the wine? And then how vivid is the feeling of the wine in the mouth? So those are the first set of questions. And then we have a second set of questions.
Can I ask a question?
Yes.
And I'm still trying to get online.
Yeah.
You ought to revise this for those who don't drink alcohol.
It is true, but in our
And there are some in this room, I know.
So for this questionnaire, we specifically targeted wine drinkers.
Right.
But the same kind of setup can easily be applied to other beverages that
Okay.
are not alcoholic. It just happens that expertise in the chemical senses, wine is probably the most studied subject.
Correct.
Also, when I was in Oxford, I spent years training the Oxford blind tasting team, so I have a personal relationship to wine training. But to go back to the presentation, the second part of the questionnaire has to do with asking people to describe with free text their experiences with the color of the wine, the smell of the wine, the taste, and the mouthfeel. Yes. So in the actual study that we conducted, it was very similar to this, except people had to go through 6 different scenarios. So, oh, that worked that time. Great. So the aims of the study that we ran, we wanted to explore differences between experts and novices on their ability to imagine the color, smell, taste, and mouthfeel of the wine. We also wanted to explore the differences between experts and novices in how they use language to describe the different parts of wine. And we wanted to see whether this imagery, vividness, and language use are related. So the methods, this was an online study. We used both wine experts and also novices, so people who are not so familiar with wine. You can see that we had some both English and Dutch participants because one of the co-authors of the paper, Iliad, is from the Netherlands. So we had a mix of both British and Dutch participants in both sides. And the study that people did was very similar to what you guys just went through, right? People had to rate the imagery on a scale from 1 to 5. They also had to use free text. And the 2 blocks were randomized, whether people got the imagery first or whether people got the text first. So let's look at some results. I think by now most people have answered at least the numbers part, so it's also fun because you can think about how your results compare to most people's. So the first aim was to look at differences between experts and novices, right, on their ability to imagine the vividness of these different aspects. I can walk people through it. So on the x-axis, we have color, mouthfeel, smell, and taste, right, the different aspects of the wine imagery. On the y-axis, we have from 1 to 5, the vividness scale that we did. The light blue are novices, the dark blue are the experts. And what we find is that for color, there is no difference in imagery vividness between experts and novices, but if you look at mouthfeel, smell, and taste, for all three more taste-related modalities, the experts have higher vividness of imagery than novices. Maybe not so surprising. I think what is possibly a bit more surprising is that there is no difference in color. So then we wanted to look at differences in language usage. Before I get into the actual results, I want to give you some examples that I chose from the data, the actual data sets that we got. So for example, this is also for the sparkling wine scenario. For novices, this was one person's example, right? They said light color was loads of little bubbles for describing the color. Describing the smell, sweet and comforting. I just realized I have a pointer, which doesn't work. Okay, the taste of the wine, sweet like a dessert, gassy and drinkable, and in the mouthfeel was cold and gassy. And if you compare with what the experts say, and you can, maybe before you even say anything, right, think about the differences between the use of language. The color of the wine, pale gold with hints of bright yellow. The smell of the wine, apple and apricots with hints of lime, honey and white flowers. The taste of the wine, high acidity, constant and uniform bubbles, very creamy and balanced. And the mouthfeel was fresh, round, soft, and nutty. I think actually the expert one was my husband's day. So you can already see, right, there's very different use of language in how novices and experts describe wine sensations, or imagine wine sensations rather, I should say. So the first thing we looked at is how many words do they use to describe. And here again, we have modality on the x-axis, and then on the y-axis, we have something that's called amount of lemmas. Lemmas are basically words, but it's the form of the word under which it's registered in the dictionary. So it's like the stem of the word. And here we can see almost the same results as for the imaginary vividness. For color, there's no difference in the amount of words people use. But for mouthfeel, for smell, and for taste, experts use more words to describe their imagined experience compared to novices. So then we get a little bit more technical. We wanted to look at this concept called concreteness. Let me explain. So concreteness refers to the extent to which a word denotes a perceptual entity. So things like a fruit or an herb or a flower, something that you can imagine. And this concreteness, so we looked, I think I have a reference, yes. So we found a reference looking at concreteness rating of language, and we basically took people's words and looked it up in this lexicon to deduce a concreteness rating. And in this case, we see that for color and mouthfeel, there's no difference in concreteness of word use between novices and experts. But for smell and taste, again, experts tend to use more concrete words to describe their experiences compared to novices. It's also interesting if you just look overall, right? For color, concreteness is pretty high compared to mouthfeel. So people have an easier time, perhaps, finding concrete words to describe color, but not to describe the texture, the mouthfeel sensation. And then we looked at this concept called a source term, and I will explain. So a source term refers to similes that describes, one thing in terms of another. So for example, something smells like lemon zest, or something smells like flint. And here we see, actually really interesting, that for color, mouthfeel, smell, and taste, for all four modalities, experts tend to use more source terms than novices. And you can also see that it's really smell and taste where there's a lot of these kind of similes going on. Okay, now to the maybe less interesting results. Our study aim3, looking at whether this ability to imagine imagery, whether this vividness is related to word use. So we ran a regression so the predictors are the dark blue, number of words, concreteness, type of words. We also looked at something adjective-noun ratio, which I didn't really mention before, and looking at the different modalities, right? Color, smell, taste, and mouthfeel. And we looked at how do those predict the actual vividness of imagery. In short, it doesn't really. For novices, the only thing that had a significant impact was modality. So novices had different imagery vividness based on which sensor modality it was, but we knew that already. So nothing about language predicted the imagery vividness. For experts, it's even worse. So for experts, nothing really predicts. Nothing in their use of language predicts imagery vividness, which was maybe a little bit disappointing, but we can see. So in summary, first, if you just look at vividness of mental imagery, wine experts have more vivid imagery than novices for smell, taste, and mouthfeel. Experts use different language than novices for these imagined wines. They used longer descriptions, more concrete, more specific words. And language use did not predict imagery vividness, which perhaps supports the notion that imagery and language are separate cognitive skills involved in wine expertise. So we do have a paper here, which is published, and if anyone would like to read it, feel free to scan the QR code. I am just here to promote our research. So on that note, that's my talk. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. So today I invite you to imagine what scent looked like in early modern Japan. My focus is not on scent as substance, but on scent as image or in image. Specifically, I'll be talking about visualization of one particular incense matching game, which you see lurking in the background. And I will show you how scent became a metaphor for cultural literacy. I take this visual approach partly because I do research on material and visual culture, not on sensory history. But more importantly, the swirl of visual materials I will introduce suggests that smelling good, or not just you smelling good, but also smelling something good, was a matter of refinement and decorum. But for us to understand this, I first have to make the case of how and why smell mattered in the Japanese tradition.
Does it work? No? Okay, one second. Okay, try again.
Yeah. So one key reason, I think, lies in the arrival of Buddhism in Japan in the 7th century via China. With it came the ritual use of incense, an aromatic offering that quickly captivated the court elite. The Tamamashi shrine you see here, named after the jewel beetle whose wings once shimmered and glimmered across its surface, depicts incense as both scent and symbol. On the front of this plinth, beneath a pair of divine figures, you're flying over there, you see two monks kneeling in front of a sacred incense censer or burning incense burner. And even in this earliest national treasure, incense is revered not just for its aroma, but for its spiritual resonance. And this reverence also derives obviously from rarity. Aromatic woods such as agarwood and sandalwood do not grow naturally in Japan, so they were imported from South and Southeast Asia and reserved for the elite and used primarily in religious ceremonies such as this one. So from the start, fragrance in Japan was more than sensory, it was spiritual and highly exclusive. But from the classical period onward, I'm talking about the 11th century onward, incense moved beyond religious ritual. A new method of producing incense emerged. Instead of burning whole incense woods, people began blending powdered aromatic woods with natural ingredients such as musk, with other natural binders like honey or plum paste. The result was a kneaded incense, richly textured and often personally customized. Those residing in the palace began scenting the air of rooms simply for pleasure. And this picture scroll from the 12th century, you see a man fanning. Oh, this man fanning. This is a fanning the incense in his hair, and you also see a passerby, a man in black attire, perhaps wondering who is inside burning something so fragrant. And infusing clothing with fragrance also became common,
And in this painting, I could only find this painting from the 18th century, and we have textual evidence from the 12th and medieval classical period, but this is I just thought maybe visual would be more appealing. But in this painting from the 18th century, you see a courtesan fumigating her kimono with incense, and notice the small burner tucked under her hem. And if you follow the trail of the smoke, that's actually a very subtle trail of the smoke, and it becomes clear that she is soaking her robe in scent. But incense wasn't just smelled or burned to purify space or to perfume. It was also played, first as contest, then game, and eventually as cultural icon. In elite circles, fragrance connoisseurs created their own fragrance blends, like I said, but these incense formulas were kept secrets and never publicly shared. And these custom blends were central to courtly pastimes such as this intense mixing contest, and where contestants presented their personalized blend and judges determined which yielded the finest scent. And we see actually this in the 11th century literary epic, The Tale of Genji. So short synopsis of The Tale of Genji is about this 11th century Japanese tale, often hailed as the world's first psychological novel, arguably. And if I may, it's 10,000 plus pages of Heian aristocrats catching feelings under moonlight. and this is written by Murasaki Shikibu, a court lady with a razor-sharp brush, and it follows this irresistibly handsome Prince Genji, and as he seduces his way through the imperial court, leaving behind a wake of poetic longing and emotional complexity, blah blah blah. So it's equal parts romance, political commentary, but also existential slow burn. And it was, most importantly, it was the most widely read and referenced classical novel in pre-modern Japan. So everyone knew about this. And actually in chapter 32 of 54 chapters of The Tale of Genji, he is now grown up, and he has a daughter who is preparing for her entry into court service. And Genji, the father, and his lovers, including former and current lovers, they engage in incense contests. And in this painting, Genji, this man, he only just received a blend from one of the competitors, of course a former lover, and reads the poem tucked into the agarwood box. And notice these two glass jars filled with rather large incense bowls. And elsewhere in this novel, The Tale of Genji, the author reflects on the cultural power of scent. And courted people could be identified by the fragrance they left behind, just from a trace behind a curtain or screen. And if we go back to these slides, so in an environment where people were physically hidden or secluded by those curtains and screens, smell became a more intimate mode of recognition than sight. And this is key. Incense and incense blends were seen as extensions of the self. They express aesthetic taste and cultural refinement. And another type of olfactory pastime was incense matching games. So instead of comparing which yields the most pleasant, they started smelling something and identify the patterns or what scent, or which fragrance wood that is from. And this game flourished from in the early modern period, from the 17th century onward. The basic rules are quite simple. Participants identify different types of incense by smell alone, and the person who gets the most correct wins. And there are myriad variants of this game with different playtimes and how to notate the answer. And among those variants, Genjiko, or the Genji incense game, is the most well known. You might recognize the name Genjiko, and it is indeed based on The Tale of Genji, which I just mentioned. And based on this classic novel, it transforms scent into visual puzzle and connoisseurship, which I will explain later. But how does this game actually work? So according to some other period sources, the rules are as follows. Participants enter a room like this, just Japanese room, and forming two opposite teams, and they say according to social ranks. But there's one game master who has prepared 25 pouches, consisting of 5 pouches for each 5 different incense types. So often tiny chips of aromatic wood. From these, the game master selects only 5 and burns them in sequence in different sensors. and the game master would pass those sensors around to the room so that contestants can smell and identify the patterns. The goal is to identify the pattern of the 5 different scents and draw the correct diagram of all the possible diagrams. And you would guess, if you're in the participant, you would wonder, are they all the same patterns, or are they all the same incense, or are they some repeated? And the most simple one is, if you think all are different, you would draw the one on the top right one, so which actually corresponds to the chapter 2 of the Tale of Genji, the broom tree. But most of the time, it's not this simple. Probably you get some incense repeated. And to confuse things further, Japanese writing runs from right to left. So this is some little quiz for you, just to make sure you're not asleep. Suppose you think maybe 1st, 3rd, 4th, and 5th are the same, but the 2nd is different. Do you know which diagram you would want to get? I mean, it's hard to maybe. Somewhere. Yes, this one. So right here. Yes. Thank you so much. Yeah. So the answer should look like. Oh. Yes. Which corresponds to chapter 32, which I just actually mentioned before. So mathematically, don't worry, I didn't do the math, but there are 52 possible answers, patterns, and each mapped onto 52 chapters of the Tale of Genji, excluding the first and the last. So these abstract patterns became known as Genji Konozu, or the Genji Ko diagrams. And you might be wondering, why does each diagram correspond to one specific chapter? And that is a great question, and lots of scholars still argue to date. And in fact, the exact logic behind these pairings is utterly unclear. But this ambiguity, I think, invites speculation and further play, which I think is exactly what makes Genji Ko diagrams so appealing. Let me give you an example. So this is the one we correctly guessed earlier, and this diagram corresponds to the 32nd chapter. This pattern shows 4 identical lines connected by 1 horizontal line and 1 short line. And now, in the Genji narrative, this chapter features a lively scene where, if you remember, there is a incense contest happens, and when you look at this diagram, you see short line that's standing out. Maybe that might seem like Genji himself, surrounded by a cluster of women, or maybe it's his daughter who is set apart in her uniqueness. And this is not me just making up something, but it's actually Japanese scholars argue this. And in other words, the diagram invites you to project your own meanings, imaginatively and socially. Maybe you start to ask, is this the Tale of Genji really about the protagonist, Genji, or is it actually held together by the lives of women around him? In other words, you don't need to have read the entirety of Genji to appreciate the diagram itself, but if you have the knowledge of what actually is going on in the novel, you can make it into a cultural puzzle, inviting you to find correspondences, hidden meanings, and even contradictions in these simple just lines and diagrams. And though scentless, the Genji Ko diagrams linger like fragrant traces, and these their visual afterlife is very fascinating, and so I would like to take you through our tour with this. So I will take you across the visual culture of how deeply the Genji Ko diagrams permeated the visual culture. The first category is educational primers, which suggests that knowledge about the Genji Ko diagrams became part of genteel education, especially for young women. In the didactic work titled Women's Great Learning Treasure Box, we find the Genji Ko diagrams placed at the top of the table of contents, and this suggests that knowledge of the incense game became part of the training, especially for young women. I still have to figure out why it's only for women, but we see a lot in female textbooks. And books like this one elegant collection of writing for women, we read, the reason a woman wears incense is not merely for, oh sorry, I go ahead of myself. Books like this one, adapted courtly etiquettes for townspeople. In this illustration accompanying the table of contents is also table of contents. We see girls appreciating incense, and she's literally sniffing the incense. This book is special because it offers knowledge relevant to the everyday life settings of that mirror the readers, townspeople's own lives, and which this book apparently didn't, according to the author of this book. So this book adapted actual townspeople's life into the educational materials. And finally, and in this elegant collection of writing for women, we read, the reason a woman wears incense is not just merely for elegance, but to keep her own unclean scent from offending others. It is a matter of decorum, not just style. In other words, fragrance was ethical, not just aesthetic, and knowing Genjiko diagrams, or Genjiko, the ritual of the game, was part of being respectable. And this ethos of being a connoisseur of good smell permeated another media, which is fashion. And kimono pattern books were published widely from the 17th century till the 19th century, and used by both kimono merchants and customers to select fabric designs. And from the early 18th century onward, Genjiko diagrams begin to appear in these volumes as decorative motifs, like this. Yeah, thank you. But you would wonder why the Genjiko diagrams on kimono? And because it makes visual sense. Earlier, we saw a painting of a woman perfuming her kimono with incense. That intimate act of scenting one's clothing became a design idea. And these patterns just don't illustrate the Genjiko diagrams. You see them combined with other aesthetic motifs. And though incense is ephemeral, when you see those in these textiles, they leave a visual residue. And here, this diagram transcend this boundary of the game, incense matching game, and take root in the textile design. And things get even more interesting in the 19th century. By the early 19th century, kimono pattern books declined, the publication of kimono pattern books declined, but the Genjiko did not disappear at all. It migrated to ukiyo-e prints, or especially portraits of beautiful women, like this one. And diagrams, so in those prints of beautiful women, diagrams decorate the books they're reading, or even the hairpins and kimono and such. And this trend was fueled by the hit parody novel, A Fraudulent Murasaki's Bumpkin Genji. It's sort of adaptation of the tale of Genji, which ran to 76 volumes and sold over 10,000 copies each, which is a sensation. And it is, in fact, a stinky book. I'm paying a cheeky homage to Dr. Tullett's presentation. But I bet this wasn't stinky because it sold so well. The publisher started to, maybe we can make money out of it. So they started using better quality paper, maybe not so stinky ink, and they started decorating book covers with, of course, Genjiko motif diagrams. And then by then, Genjiko, the diagrams, had little to do with the actual game. It was a cultural meme, instantly recognizable and endlessly referential. And I would like to finally you to consider these two prints. So on the fan of the woman on the left, you see the Genjiko diagram, and which corresponds to the one for chapter 23. But the kimono version, so you see this one on this one's kimono actually. But if you pay close attention, the kimono's version is technically incorrect. So the logic is the same. So one independent, second, fourth, same, third and fifth, same. But technically, it's the wrong notation of this 23rd chapter, and which this print got right. Yet, this didn't matter. People recognized the reference. People recognized that these diagrams reference the tale of Genji, even if they've never played the actual incense matching game. So Genjiko diagrams began as notations, but they drifted into educational primers, kimono designs, and popular prints such as these. So they became aesthetic motifs decoupled from the incense game itself. So to sum up, in early modern Japan, you didn't need to play the incense game to enjoy the diagrams. Their legibility was anchored in the nation's most beloved novel, and which made them accessible in a way other incense practices, other incense games were not. So despite innovations like kneaded incense, appreciation of incense still demanded rare woods and very expensive lots of tools. And you also had to have elaborate calligraphic skills and coding manners and such. And this caption is actually very telling. I forgot to translate, but it means wife of a very wealthy merchant. So you have to be wealthy enough to afford all these things for the incense game. But the Genshiko diagrams, in contrast, were accessible and instantly recognizable and could be fueled infinitely if you have had knowledge about the tale of Genji. A diagram could say, oh. So, as a coda, in the world of the Genjiko motifs or diagrams, scent becomes memory and fleeting fragrance becomes form. Legible not to the nose, you don't smell anything, but to the eye. Ephemeral, yes, it is very ephemeral, but also eternalized and frozen in the image. And to close, I'd like to return to the tale of Genji and to the poem that the Genji is holding, and which accompanied the incense bowls, if you remember. And these incense bowls are from his former lover, and it's with the poem, which reads, "The scent of flowers linger not upon the dough whence they have scattered, but may deeply perfume the sleeves it will soon infuse." So Genji's former lover here reflects on the fragrance of her youth, which has obviously left her sleep, and she cannot reclaim it because her time is past. But she hopes that it graces Genji's daughter, hopefully to win the heart of the next emperor. So fragrance in this sense speaks more eloquently than words. And its eloquence, strangely, left us with a set of straight lines and blank spaces, which then loosely connect to the allure of the courtly elegance. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. That was absolutely wonderful. And I'm sure we've got lots of questions, but let's hold them for after the presentation of Alessandro Cancian. He is a senior research associate at the Institute of Ismaili Studies in London, where he works on Shi'i Sufism, Quranic exegesis, and the intellectual and religious history of early modern Iran. He has published books and articles on religious education in Shi'i Islam, Sufism, and Quranic exegesis, including The Emergence of Shi'i Sufism in Early Modern Iran, which was published in 2023. He is also an amateur perfumer and, among other projects, has created a bespoke fragrance for the exhibition The Quran, Form, Fragrance and Feeling, and he is also working on a 19th century treatise on perfume making written by an Iranian Sheikhi master. Over to you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Thank you for the introduction. And actually, the treatise I mentioned, she mentioned in the introduction, is the treatise I'm going to talk to you about today from a specific angle. I think the more I look into this treatise, the more the more angles I find that I could look at it from. Without further ado, in a previous study, I have introduced this 19th century treatise on perfumery, authored by a master of a significant religious current within Iran and Shi'i Islam, Sheikh here, and began to explore perfumery and esotericism, or perhaps perfumery as esotericism and theurgy in early modern Iran. The treatise is entitled Mejmare, or Mijmara if you want to stick to the Arabic pronunciation, but it's written in Persian, which means incense burner. It's also the name of a constellation, we'll get back to that. And the master is the Protean Karim Khan Kermani, who died in 1871, the founder of one of the branches of Sheikhism.
Yes.
Okay. In that study, I had suggested, and this is my starting point, that the author of that work anticipated, in certain ways, some values and practices of modern perfumery, specifically with regard to the aesthetic principles laid out in that work. In this presentation, I will explore Karim Khan Kermani's take on the Shi'i theosophy theory of imagination and assess its consequences on his practice as a perfumer in the context of the intellectual and social history of early modern Iran and Shi'i esotericism. I will review my contention that he anticipates modern perfumery based on a more nuanced appraisal of the concept of modern perfumery, which this time around I will consider not only as indivisible from the emergence of modern chemistry, but also, and more significantly, as inseparable from the capitalist transformation of global markets that go hand in hand with the technological revolutions of the 19th and early 20th century. In the framework of the delayed integration of early modern Iran within global economy. I will argue, therefore, that Karim Khan Kermani's creative imagination as a perfumer, but also as a practitioner of many other arts and crafts, informed by the sophisticated theory of imagination of Shi'i Islamic mysticism, cannot be aptly captured by any definition of modernity. Since Karim Khan's forays into free creativity and aesthetical originality, along with the many other elements he shares with modern perfumery, resists to the commodification of imagination required of modern perfumery by market society. By looking at Kermani's aesthetics through the lens of the idea of the imaginal, okay, this is just a quotation from an Orientalist, Marx, the idea of the imaginal, yeah, wait, okay, I stick to Marx. I am going to move away from an evolutionary approach, that is, modern perfumery as the coronation of a process from infancy to maturity, and suggest that the Shi'i imaginal world is a citadel impenetrable to the commodification of the experiential value of the perfumer. In fact, by protecting that citadel, while at the same time allowing space for the diversity of tastes of early modern Iran, Karim Khan Kermani may represent an antidote, or at least might provide an alternative version of imagination, an antidote to the capitalist violence unleashed on creative imagination, and specifically, in this case, on the perfumer's imagination. But how market society, very quickly, how market society appropriated the perfumer's imagination? Today's perfumery industry is a result of the maturation of the mutation that global capitalism underwent over the last century and a half. The forces unleashed by the Industrial Revolution, which encompassed the development of organic chemistry, without which modern perfumery would not exist, are pregnant with the power to starve and overwork, to turn a source of wealth into a source of want, unquote, and to transform imagination and creativity into a measurable source of profit, into a commodity. This mutation was accelerated spectacularly in the 20th century as a result of, one, the birth of big finance following the development of electromagnetism in the early 20th century. Megawatts translated into mega profits, which in turn created the first mega debts in the form of vast overdraft facilities for the big corporations. And two, the emergence of the so-called technostructures, is a word from Galbraith. That is the post-1929 private-public decision-making mechanism in which business and government became profoundly entwined. The technostructure, in making connections between science and industry, formed and employed an army of sensory specialists who laid the foundation for the modern practice of exploiting the senses for commercial purposes. Acknowledging the intimate connection between the productive capacities of industrial capitalism and the fundamental role of the senses in consumer experience, perfume manufacturers turned perfume makers into noses, that's a definition, who could become specialists in olfactory branding. that is manipulators of their own imaginations and of those of the customers. Aesthetic judgment or sensory judgment became an integral part of business strategies in consumer product development among managerial firms at the center of the economy. Capitalism has drawn on the embodied power of olfaction and influenced the changing modes in which scents are imagined and experienced. The perfumery industry, as we know it today, owes its profitability to the exploitation of the experiential value of the manipulated perfumer's imagination. How the perfumer negotiates the space between freedom and coercion, between authenticity and alienation, is exactly where their imagination finds ways to maintain its experiential value, free from market manipulation. Our author, Karin Conker-Moni, and his treatise on perfume making represent a chapter in the history of olfaction and imagination that, while conceding openings to the changes of Iranian society at the time when global markets were starting to transform the economy and production, tells about the existence of alternative modes of imagining scents and imagining perfume making, olfaction and fragrance, that capitalism can hardly penetrate and manipulate. But who is Karin Conker-Moni? So this guy is not the typical fashionable perfumer, as you can see. He was one of the most original masters of the Sheikhi school, of this minority, intellectual minority in Iran. Well, born in Iraq, but then transplanted in Iran. So he was the master of the founder of one of the branches of this school. He was a sort of universal genius, a sort of Renaissance man with multiple talents, endowed with a lot of skills, who wrote on a vast array of religious, technical, scientific and artistic questions, which he consistently envisaged from a theosophical point of view. So he was a mystical master to begin with. He was the founder of the Kermani branch of the Sheikhia. It was controversial, had family connections with the royal family, with the Babaie royal family. He had inherited an immense library from his father, who served as governor for the Shah of Iran. Around the library, he established a sort of religious center, school, educational institution called Ibrahimiyeh. His work is immense. The list of books attributed to him is short of 300, and his biographer report that there was a period in his life when he was writing a book, more than one book per week. That made me think, when I first approached his treatise on perfumery, that it was just some copy of some Indian treatise on perfumery that he found in his library, but that is not the case, and that's exactly my point. His contribution to the early modern Shi'i thought is undeniable, as some of the concepts and ideas for which the Sheikhi doctrine, the doctrine of the school, is distinctively known, have been developed by himself. He is the bearer of a quite radically esoteric description of the origin of his knowledge. So his knowledge is, to cut it short, of supernatural origin. But he's also controversial. He was a conservative cleric from some point of view, who breaks away with the program of social and religious reforms that his school is supposed to have promoted. So he rejects rampant westernization, famously critiques the Dar al-Funun, so the technical school that was established in Tehran in the mid-19th century. And he was also, I'm not romanticizing him, because he was also active in the fight against another religious minority, Babism, whereby he was issuing call for execution of their missionaries. So I don't want to romanticize the personality. He famously authored a medical treatise, the Daroyekol Eloge, which became very popular and was widely consulted and quoted in the 19th century. And even today, I'm sad that the heirs of his school in Iraq still practice some sort of traditional medicine based on his medicine treatise. But anyway, let's get to imagination, his theory of imagination, and then I will slowly go to towards the conclusion. So, okay. The theorization of the Olam al-Mithal or Alam al-Mithal, depending on the pronunciation you prefer, which is I call it with Henri Corbin, who coined the mundus imaginal, the imaginal world as distincted from the imaginary world, has a long and complex history among the philosopher and theosopher of Islam. To simplify for the purpose of this presentation, let us just define it as a realm endowed with objective ontological reality, in which the purely spiritual communicate with the physical by way of subtle images and forms. Hence the very successful definition of it as mundus imaginalis, imaginal world, coined by Henri Corbin. The active, creative imaginal is distinct from the passive, fallacious imaginary precisely for its ontological consistency. The mystic has access to creative imagination through devotion and specific spiritual exercises, anticipating in life the faculties of the virtuous soul in the afterlife. The nexus between the theory of the Alam al-Mithal and the artistic creativity for the power of composing new meaningful images is of course the essential foundation of every artistic creation. While clearly prominent in the Mejmare, in the treatise under scrutiny, the best theorization by Karim Khan of the imaginal world is offered in a short treatise on the theory of colors, among the many things that he wrote, written in in 1851. How long do I have?
About 5.
Okay. I'm getting that. So, in Karim Khan conceptualization, the dualism between spirit and body disappears, thanks to the existence of this dimension, of this realm. The body becomes subtle, and the spirit takes a subtle body. These forms existing in the mundus imaginalis are perceived not by the senses, but by the active imagination, which applies to sense, means that this produces something more than a theory, produces a phenomenology of sense, which unveils the modes of reality of sense. They exist and are real in all the different realms, in the physical, in the imaginary, and in the multitude of other worlds that he theorizes about. The master stretches the boundaries of traditional Shi'i theosophy, pushing perceptions beyond the sensible world, in a way in which symbolism morphs into a visionary realism. So, basically, to put it very simple, the visions are actually existent. And by vision, here I include also the manifestation of sense. Okay, let me cut this one short and move to the accounts. Okay, the Mejmare, the treatise. It was compiled in 1856. Yes. And when I first came across it, I thought it would be, as I mentioned, a superficial copy of some Indian work. But then, as you read it, you can actually see the perfumer at work. You can see his hands on the perfumer, and biographers also confirmed the fact that he was actually not only practicing medicine, but he was tinkering with essential oils, with ingredients, and people would go to him to. The boundary between his activity as physician and as perfumer is very slim, because he was also using perfumes as a means of aromatherapy. So the work is a short work, is 20 folios in the holograph manuscript, is composed of an introduction, yes, an introduction, 7 chapters and a conclusive appendix, mainly devoted to the explanation of Indian weights and measures. And these are the topics of the chapters, so the nature of perfume, chapter 1. These are different kinds of, different classes of perfumes. And then, very interesting, he also gives the recipes for scented bowls and candles, perfume paste, and so on and so forth. Yeah, candles, candle wick. So it was, very, very comprehensive. So the remarkable elements of this work, and then I conclude. It is hard to discern the esoteric and the spiritual from the aesthetics. Attempting that would perhaps be even delusional, and I argue that it is epistemologically flawed, given the premises on the imaginal that he makes. No dualism between spirit and body means no need to distinguish the aesthetic from the spiritual. But let's see among the remarkable elements. So, perfumes share a number of elements with prayer. They live somewhere in between the spiritual and the material. Different scents combine archetypically in the mundus imaginalis, and he says, he explains this kind of combination, this imaginal combination in this realm. And quote, imagine how numerous angels descend upon a small piece of land, dwell there, and yet do not intermingle. So do perfumes. Another example of this idea, and I quote, if you were to gather 1,000 types of flower in a single room, each with its unique fragrance, all those scents would fill every particle of that room. Each flower's fragrance would accompany it, and the reason for this is that fragrances are not of the dense material world. They belong to the realm of imagination. They possess a spirituality. And then I skip, there's so many other interesting quotes that I would like to reflect on, maybe later in the Q&A. Let me get to the modern perfumery element to conclude. The author's argument. No, I have to skip. Okay. Yes. So, Karim Khan-Kermani writes his Mejmare in the years in which proto-modern perfumery was reshaping the markets, and with them the tastes of the region. Eau de Cologne, a compound that had originally been created in the 18th century as a herbal remedy to be taken orally, would soon supplant rose water as a staple fragrance to be offered to guests in Turkish households. And its indigenized version would become distinctive of the Turkish perfume culture throughout the 20th century. In Indian urban centers, too, locally produced formulation books were circulated in and across the market and the production centers. In 19th century Iran, from this respect, represent an exception, and Karim Khan-Kermani is emblematic of this. His creativity seems unruly, only relatively constrained by the parameters of the tradition that he cherishes so much. He is a mystical master and esotericist, but the Mejmare demonstrate his closeness to the Persianate South Asian figure of the Hakim or the Zarif, combining with that an aesthetics that draws on the phenomenology of the imaginal, and is therefore radically esoteric and visionary. As theoretician and practitioner of a wide range of sciences, Hakims were expected to master all branches of knowledge in order to know the natural world as it truly is in its manifold reality, its operations, as well as those principles that explain its ontology. Marx believed that sensory experience was debased by capitalism, but would ultimately be redeemed. On the production side, Marx saw a distinct sensory dimension of 19th century factory labor. For the most part, however, he believed that capitalism degraded and suppressed sensory experience, not only for the proletariat, but also for the bourgeoisie, who regularly forwent sensual satisfaction in favor of even greater capital accumulation. Conversely, Marx imagined sensory liberation as part of capitalism's demise. The abolition of private property of the means of production would lead to the complete, quoting, the complete emancipation of all human senses. 19th century Iran does not qualify as capitalist, of course, nor Karim Khan Kermani would oppose the abolition of private property. But Iran's proto-capitalist features allowed for the indigenization of modern epistemic structures in Iran that, through the integration of the country in the international capitalist framework, in which local labor was exploited to produce commodities for world markets, prefigured the hijacking of the artist's imagination by the emerging market society. Therefore, although research on the perfumery industry, in particular on the profession of the perfumer profession in 19th century Iran, is frustratingly inadequate, because Karim Khan Kermani represents a unique example, we suggest that the answer to that question may be irrelevant. So, was he a pioneer of modern perfumery, or was he anticipating modern? Is ultimately irrelevant. I mean, it's an open question. I don't really have an answer, but I'm concluding. Despite the analogies that we have mentioned, Karim Khan Kermani's reliance on the creative imagination of the imaginal makes him hardly vulnerable to the rapacious manipulative thrust of market society. Surely the imaginal, as theorized by him and other theosophers, is hardly commodifiable, and is perhaps an experiential value that no marketing executive, no technostructure can appropriate.